Thinking he had made a mistake, he was about to try another room when June opened the door to see what the matter was. She gave him a glad smile. "Come on," he said, and when she went for her bonnet, he stepped into the room. "How do you like it?" June nodded toward the window, and Hale went to it. "There's Uncle Billy's mill out there." "Why, so it is," said Hale, smiling. "That's fine." The schoolhouse, to June's wonder, had shingles on the outside around all the walls from roof to foundation, and a big bell hung on top of it under a little shingled roof of its own. A pale little man with spectacles and blue pale eyes met them at the door, and he gave June a pale slender hand and cleared his throat before he spoke to her. "She's never been to school," said Hale. "She can read and spell, but she's not very strong on arithmetic." "Very well, I'll turn her over to the primary." The school bell sounded. Hale left with a parting prophecy: "You'll be proud of her some day," at which June blushed, and then with a beating heart she followed the little man into his office. A few minutes later the assistant came in, and she was none other than the wonderful young woman whom Hale had called Miss Anne. There were a few instructions in halting voices and with much clearing of the throat from the pale little man, and a moment later June walked the gauntlet of the eyes of her schoolmates, every one of whom looked up from his book to hers to watch her as she went to her seat. Miss Anne pointed out the arithmetic lesson, and without lifting her eyes, June bent with a flushed face to her task. It was reddened with shame when she was called to the class, for she sat on the bench taller by a head and more than any of the boys and girls thereon, except one awkward youth who caught her eye and grinned with unashamed companionship. The teacher noticed her look and understood with a sudden keen sympathy, and naturally she was struck by the fact that the new pupil was the only one who never missed an answer. "She won't be there long," Miss Anne thought, and she gave June a smile for which the little girl was almost grateful. June spoke to no one, but walked through her schoolmates homeward, when school was over, like a haughty young queen. Miss Anne had gone ahead and was standing at the gate talking with Miss Crane, and the young woman spoke to June most kindly. "Mr. Hale has been called away on business," she said, and June's heart sank. "And I'm going to take care of you until he comes back." "I'm much obliged," she said, and while she was not ungracious, her manner indicated her belief that she could take care of herself, and Miss Anne felt uncomfortably that this extraordinary young person was steadily measuring her from head to foot. June saw the smart, close-fitting gown, the dainty little boots, and the carefully brushed hair. She noticed how white her teeth were and her hands, and she saw the nails look polished, and that the tips of them were like little white crescents, and she could still see every detail when she sat at her window, looking down at the old mill. She saw Mr. Hale when he left, the young lady had said, and she had a headache now and was going home to lie down. She understood now what Hale meant on the mountainside when she was so angry with him. She was learning fast, and the most from the two persons who were not conscious what they were teaching her. And she would learn in the school, too, for the slumbering ambition in her suddenly became passionately definite now. She went to the mirror and looked at her hair. She would learn how to plait that in two braids down her back, as the other schoolgirls did. She looked at her hands, and straightway she fell to scrubbing them with soap as she had never scrubbed them before. As she worked, she heard her name called, and she opened the door. "Yes, ma'am," she answered, for already she had picked that up in the schoolroom. "Come on, June, and go down the street with me." "Yes, ma'am," she repeated, and she wiped her hands and hurried down. Mrs. Crane had looked through the girl's pathetic wardrobe while she was at school that afternoon, had told Hale before he left, and she had a surprise for little June. Together they went down the street and into the chief store in town, and to June's amazement Mrs. Crane began ordering things for this little girl. "Who's going to pay for all those things?" whispered June aghast. "Don't you bother, honey. Mr. Hale said he would fix all that with your pappy. It's some coal deal or something. Don't you bother." And June, in a quiver of happiness, didn't bother. Stockings, petticoats, some soft stuff for a new dress, and tan shoes that looked like the ones that wonderful young woman wore, and then some long white things. "What's them for?" she whispered. But the clerk heard her and laughed, whereat Mrs. Crane gave him such a glance that he retired quickly. "Nightgowns, honey." "You sleep in 'em?" said June in an awed voice. "That's just what you do," said the good old woman, hardly less pleased than June. "My, but you got pretty feet. I wish they were half as pretty as—" "Well, they are," interrupted Mrs. Crane, a little snappishly. Apparently she did not like Miss Anne. "Wrap 'em up, and Mr. Hale will attend to the bill." "All right," said the clerk, looking much mystified. Outside the door June looked up into the beaming goggles of the Honorable Samuel Budd. "Is this the little girl? Howdy, June," he said, and June put her hand in the Honorable Sam's with a sudden trust in his voice. "I'm goin' to help you take care of you, too," said Mr. Budd, and June smiled at him with shy gratitude. How kind everybody was! "I'm much obleeged," she said, and she and Mrs. Crane went on back with their bundles. June's hands so trembled when she found herself alone with her treasures that she could hardly unpack them. When she had folded and laid them away, she had to unfold them and look at them again. She hurried to bed that night merely that she might put on one of those wonderful nightgowns, and again she had to look all her treasures over. She was glad she had brought the doll because he had given it to her, but she said to herself, "I'm getting too big now for dolls," and she put it away. Then she set the lamp on the mantelpiece so that she could see herself in her wonderful nightgown. She let her shining hair fall like molten gold around her shoulders, and she wondered whether she could ever look like the dainty creature that just now was the model she so passionately wanted to be like. Then she blew out the lamp and sat a while by the window, looking down through the rhododendrons at the shining water and the old water wheel, sleepily at rest in the moonlight. She knelt down then at her bedside to say her prayers, as her dead sister had taught her to do, and she asked God to bless Jack, wondering as she prayed that she had heard nobody else call him Jack. And then she lay down with her breast heaving. She had told him she would never do that again, but she couldn't help it now. The tears came, and from happiness she cried herself softly to sleep. End of chapter 12.